so much for joining us. I'm Emily from NISTS, and I am delighted to be here today with colleagues from MDRC, who have recently released what I think is a really critically important research report on the role of faculty in the transfer credit decision-making process. There are lots of conversations in transfer broadly and in the research specifically around who decides what and whether transfer credits are just generally transferable or whether they are actually applicable to the degree. And so I am very excited to finally have some research on file that gives words to all the anecdotal stuff we say in the field all the time around who makes those decisions, how those decisions happen, and potentially what we can do even better to make sure folks are all on the same page and having a good broad philosophy around learning mobility and how we award credit and learning where it's due. At this time, I want to turn it over to our wonderful friends from MDRC, Sophia Sutcliffe and Marjorie Dorme-Williams, who are here to tell us all about their recent, very beefy, very significant report. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at it, but if not, I'll share the link in just a moment. We're going to talk about the faculty role and their influence in credit transfer. So Marjorie and Sophia, thanks so much for being here this afternoon, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Emily. We really appreciate it. And thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. We're really excited to talk to you about the report and our work at MDRC. I'm Marjorie Dorme-Williams, and I served as the project director for this faculty credit transfer evaluation study. Sophia also worked with me, as well as some other team members who we spent almost 3 years engaged in really deep, intensive work with our partners in the UT system. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So we're really excited, like I said, to share what we found in terms of challenges, insights, and strategies for thinking about how we can better enhance transfer student success. Sophia, do you want to introduce yourself now or later?
I'll just do a quick intro. My name is Sophia Sutcliffe. I'm a research associate at MDRC. And yeah, really excited to bring this project that is at least 5 years in the making now to a broader audience. Thank you so much for joining.
Great. So we'll share our agenda for today. And as I mentioned, that will cover sort of 5 key areas. So we'll talk a little bit about our findings, as well as the challenges that our study really highlighted for us in terms of the work that was being done by our colleagues and partners in the study. We'll spend a little bit of time talking in detail about our transfer student outcomes and what we found from our institutional partners. And then we'll share recommendations that came out of the work, not only on behalf of MDRC, but our UT campus partners as well. And then lastly, we'll spend a little bit of time also sharing our Transfer Ready framework and toolkit, which really brought together resources and information that was informed by not just research, but also practitioners, and really thinking critically in terms of how we can better support and make use of resources to improve transfer student outcomes. And then you'll see we have time for Q&A at the end. But again, as Emily shared, please feel free to put any questions in the chat and we will answer as we go. So with that, we did want to spend a little bit of time talking about the larger landscape of credit transfer. Specifically, this project took place in Texas, and a little bit about how we came to this work. And so this was really framed in terms of understanding not just the process of credit transfer or credit transfer evaluation, but really wanting to know more about the unique role that faculty played within this larger system. In particular, some of this work was inspired by a survey of CUNY faculty, that's the City University of New York, that helped us to sort of get a better sense of the scope of how faculty, both at community colleges as well as four-year institutions within the system, sort of thought about transfer students' academic readiness and what that all meant. And so we really wanted to get a more in-depth understanding of the role of faculty within systems and understanding how that credit transfer process worked. We know that it's something that's often really complex, and within the state of Texas, there are numerous laws and policies that have been put in place in efforts to improve transfer student outcomes and to improve the ease with which students are able to transfer their credits from one institution to another, particularly thinking about that vertical transfer from 2-year institutions to 4-year institutions. So really wanting to figure out what was happening, what our faculty members were thinking, what did this look like within in different institutional contexts and considering how institutions serve different student populations. And so we uncovered a lot. So within the study, some of the things that we found really, I think, highlighted for us the influence of faculty on credit transfer. And so what we learned really helped us to better understand how faculty members played a crucial role in shaping the credit transfer policy, again, particularly at four institutions within the system. And so we wanted to understand and learn how their decision making might potentially impact both the decision to accept credits that transfer to the institution or not, but also as we got into this work, I realized very quickly whether or not these credits would even apply to students' degree plans or degree maps and meet their requirements for graduation. So understanding the applicability of credits, student outcomes, and really trying to get a better understanding and sense of how faculty were working within this larger credit context, but also within the institutional context of credit transfer evaluation and understanding the relationship between faculty and other institutional units, such as advisors or the registrar's office. And so you'll see in the next slides that we really wanted to make sure that we were being comprehensive in the way that we approach thinking about this issue. So we engaged in several forms of data collection, which included working with our institutional partners to collect student data. We also worked with our institutional partners to speak with administrators who were engaged in the faculty credit transfer process. So like I mentioned, registrar's office and advisors and deans and enrollment management and faculty members. And so we really spent a lot of time getting an in-depth understanding of what these processes look like, how they were managed by faculty. And as you'll see in the next slide, we really wanted to sort of provide a comprehensive understanding of the role of faculty within credit transfer evaluation, and not simply sort of these individual or set-alone instances, but really how they fit within this larger system. As we mentioned previously, looking at faculty influence on credit transfer, there were several key findings that we wanted to highlight in our time with you today. So those 5 key findings reflected here focused on credit transfer and credit applicability. So as Emily mentioned before, understanding sort of disciplinary differences and field-specific approaches to how faculty members are understanding and evaluating credit transfer. We also recognize in this work that data and data systems and how information is shared and stored across and within institutions often presents lots of challenges that are outside sort of any individual person's purview, but can contribute to some of the difficulties that we know exist in evaluating credits and the timeliness of our ability to evaluate student credits. And then these last 2 things, we really spent a lot of time speaking with faculty, trying to understand culture and perceptions. And so we did learn, and both in the challenging sense and in the ways that faculty could be supportive to transfer students and transfer student success, how much leadership and faculty perceptions can change outcomes. Again, that's both within evaluating credits for transfer themselves, as well as in thinking about how faculty members make decisions within these more complex, nuanced systems. And so really quickly, just thinking about what some of these might mean, the credit transfer versus credit applicability for us was probably one of the key findings of this study. And what we realized very quickly in this both national and local landscape of transfer is that when there are conversations around credit transfer or learner mobility, it often focused primarily on whether or not students transfer credits would transfer from one institution to the next. And that's often where the conversation ended. We realized when we started talking to faculty and other individuals that there's a sort of a whole next step that really wasn't being talked about, and that's that credit applicability piece. Within our study, for example, and these are, I say, data that is collectively and on average, about 40% of transferred credits at some institutions didn't apply to degree requirements at the time of graduation. And so that would, of course, lead to excess credits, extended time to graduation, unfortunately, for some students, increased financial burden. And so we know that this distinction is a really important one because the consequences of it have real implications for, again, thinking about those transfer student outcomes. The second piece that we thought about when we were considering some of these outcomes had to do with understanding those disciplinary differences and field-specific approaches. And so we learned very quickly that all faculty evaluation criteria are not the same. And there are actually very good reasons for that. Some of them have to do with the unique context that some academic programs might face. And so one of the things that we learned, for example, was concerns regarding accreditation and external standards outside of the institutional standards or even state policy that faculty members were also considering or thinking about when making decisions around credit and credit transfer and whether or not they believe students would be successful within their programs. This also related to thinking about disciplinary variation. And so again, really getting the sense that there's significant discretion in credit evaluation, particularly for faculty members who are looking at this for upper level courses. So as I mentioned before, within the state of Texas, there are numerous policies in place. Texas has for example, a Common Core numbering system, all with the effort to attempt to streamline some lower division courses or some of those general education courses that students often tend to take. And then that way ensuring that when they do transfer that they are not losing those credits. And while that's a very useful and helpful step, it often doesn't attend to some of the things that we learned from faculty, which came to, again, those major requirements or thinking about upper level course reviews. And so there really was this sort of complex system of thinking about how disciplines think about transfer, but also how faculty in different departments think about transfer. This also related to our finding regarding data systems and information infrastructure challenges. For example, one of the things that was raised by faculty members was difficulty in getting some standard information for being able to evaluate courses. So for example, having access to a course syllabus. If a student took a course that was maybe several years ago, or they didn't have access to the Blackboard site, I don't know how many of you are faculty members here, but we know our syllabi might change from one year to the next. And so there really was some challenges in simply getting data to be able to systematically and in a standardized way assess and evaluate credit transfers for students who are looking to have that done by faculty, again, particularly for those upper level courses. So this lack of centralized and standardized data often caused issues. It also often contributed to some of the things that we saw when it came to these time delays. And so faculty members talked about the fact that they had to potentially reach out to a colleague or associate at another institution or reach out to a department chair or a dean simply to get access to past course information so that they could make an informed decision about how to evaluate a student's application for credit and that credit applicability to their degree plan. So really understanding that without clear data, there's a lot of institutional struggles that are tied to simply understanding or knowing both who the students are, where they're coming from, what their course history looks like, and how to appropriately evaluate that. We also learned, and I think perhaps not surprisingly, that faculty leadership and perceptions of faculty also play a role in shaping how departments think about and evaluate credit transfers, particularly thinking about whether or not students were academically prepared enough or whether their prior courses covered the right material or content in enough depth. So there was often this discussion around certainly wanting to make sure that we were being mindful of, or faculty were being mindful of, the need for students to be able to transfer their credits, for those transfer credits to be accepted, for them to apply to their degree program, but also wanting to ensure that students would be able to make that transition successfully and be able to successfully take these upper level courses at the new institution. And so there was a lot of conversation about essentially faculty wanting to be sure that this was the right decision to be made. And again, that this is all taking place in really complex systems. And so for every institution that we worked with, even within the same system, there were slight differences in how data was collected and how data was shared in the process of evaluating credits and credit transfer. And so it really was, I think, interesting to see, given our conversation with faculty and some of these challenges, what we saw in terms of the actual transfer student data and transfer student outcomes. So in the other part of the study and the report, one of the things that we focused on was thinking about how do we look at institutional student data and longitudinal institutional student data to get a better sense of what's happening with transfer students at these particular campuses. And so I say findings and we share limitations because there are several caveats that we want to add and make sure is sort of clear in the data and as we talk about it. And so the sample of students, and this really, I think, also helped us to understand and highlight how challenging it could be for institutions to have this conversation between different departments or different academic departments. Institutions collect data in very different ways. The kind of data that they keep isn't always the same. So again, that standardized or consistent way of counting who are students coming in, what courses are they bringing in with them. So for example, in our study, we share that at one of our institutions, our transfer students graduated with an average of 150 credit hours in comparison to 140 credit hours at another institution. But then we very quickly learned that, well, the way that credit hours are applied and what counts and what doesn't count isn't exactly the same. So none of these comparisons should be seen as apples to apples because they very much are not. This is also not a causal analysis. So we were really focusing simply on being able to describe what was happening with students and what we were seeing in terms of those student outcomes. So our institutional partners shared DI-5 data files on all students who had transferred to their institutions between August 2016 and August 2022. So again, wanting to get a sense of what do these trends look like over time, and really getting a sense of understanding how transfer students were navigating this system and what that looked like within these institutions. So quickly, we'll share a couple of results. One is thinking about our big picture sort of summary of what transfer student outcomes look like. So at our first institution, we partnered with the University of Texas, Arlington. And you'll see here, and I apologize because this is very small, but it is also in the report, but just wanting to sort of give a point of reference. So we looked at things like the number of credits that students earned as they were enrolled semester by semester, thinking about those who earned their bachelor's degree after transfer. So not surprisingly, for example, the first semester in, there were no students who graduated with their bachelor's degree. We think that makes sense. Up to 6 semesters after transfer. And so we see here, there's about an average of 36% of the student sample size who graduated with their bachelor's degree. So obviously thinking about where might there be room for improvement and where are we sort of losing students in this pipeline. Interestingly, we also wanted to talk a little bit about GPA and understand what that looked like for our transfer student population, particularly given faculty members' concerns about academic preparation. And this was really interesting to find that actually our transfer students in this study, in this particular sample, were doing fine academically. They transferred in with an average GPA of a 3.0, and that often increased as students spent more time at the institution. Although we saw a slight dip in that GPA after the first semester, it wasn't very different than what we would expect to see for first-time full-time students transitioning to any institution for the first time. So we were actually really, I think, pleasantly surprised to see that the data actually supported the fact that our transfer students are doing relatively well, and also relatively well compared to their peers. We also were able to obtain data on credit transfer acceptance, and that's an important part because you'll see in the next slide that it's a little bit different given how, again, our institutional partners collected and saved this data. But here we saw that there was sort of an average number of courses passed, how many credits were transferred, average that were applied after transfer, and applied at graduation. We unfortunately didn't have for UTA because they don't track data that way. On the next slide, however, you'll see that for the University of Texas, El Paso, who is one of our other partners, that they actually shared data slightly differently. And so that's why our tables look slightly different. And so in this slide, what we have for UTEP shows, again, sort of that semester transition, those average how many were enrolled after transfer, as well as those who earned their bachelor's degree after transfer. But here we were actually able to get information for credit applicability. So if you look towards the bottom of the table, you'll see that the average number of the average number of transfer credits applied at transfer actually increased at graduation. And so one of the things that we learned from our institutional partners was that the credit transfer evaluation process was often something that could potentially be ongoing. There's sort of this initial period of evaluation of credits when students first enroll or apply to the institution. But then there might be conversations with advisors or faculty members where students might see that, oh, actually this course does apply and you can earn credit for it. So this was something that faculty members actually participated in quite regularly when they talked about some of the things that they did in terms of evaluating transfer credits for students. And again, with the eye of aiming to support that successful transfer credit application to their degree program. In the next two slides, you'll see very quickly, here we use data from UTEP as well. And so here's the average number of transfer credits applied by major. So we were also interested to see if there were any disciplinary differences between students within different groups or degree plans. We do want to note that these were analyzed by student major at time of application. And while transfer credits applied to degree at graduation are analyzed at the time of graduation, there is a sort of distinction that these were sort of taking place at distinct periods of time. What we also couldn't necessarily account for are students who changed majors, because that's not something that was sort of available in the data that we were looking at. But it was, I think, interesting to see sort of some of the distinctions between where we thought we might see students coming in with more credits applied at transfer versus at graduation. And then lastly, we took a look at total credits earned at graduation for both of our institutional partners. And I think while there's some distinction between, again, sort of the mean credits that students earn within these different majors, they're not so far off for the most part. So there is, again, a mean of sort of that 130, 140, 150, more or less depending on the particular major. We also thought it was interesting to note here that depending on whether or not these were students in more professionalized majors or majors, again, that had sort of external accreditors, that we actually saw that there was a tendency for students to accumulate more credits than their peers. So what do we do with all of this information? We worked, again, hand in hand with our institutional partners and really thought about how we had learned from this process, as well as things that might be useful for other institutions, as well as systems who are aiming to make changes and improvements in credit transfer. So Sophia will share a little bit on our recommendations.
So much, Marjorie. So I'm going to try to circle back to some of the challenges and findings that Marjorie shared and map them to some corresponding recommendations and positive practices we saw in our work with the University of Texas institutions. And then I'll end my speaking time with some self-assessment tools and other resources we published also as part of this project that can be used by you, hopefully, and before we open the floor up for live questions. So the first challenge is kind of this potential for inefficient or inconsistent transfer credit evaluations, because there's so many people involved and they're often operating in silos. So faculty and advisors and registrar are all playing crucial roles, but kind of without full awareness of the broader process or each other's, potentially each other's decision-making criteria or needs and the downstream impacts, like how their role fits into the bigger picture. And this might lead to slow evaluations or the inconsistent use of practices. And so to address this, it's important to establish clear protocols for communication, what's expected in terms of how and how soon people are communicating evaluation decisions, and how those are documented. So it's, as many of you I'm sure know, it's an ACRO best practice association for, I always forget the full name, but I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about. It's a best practice to have documentation on the reasons for credits not transferring or applying, for example. Another logistical thing that slows down transfer credit evaluations and can place burden on students and the faculty for completing these evaluations is the quality and availability of information about the courses, so course descriptions and syllabi that faculty are using to make these course equivalency determinations. And so recommendations around that, there could be efforts to standardize syllabi templates for an institution or guidelines on where what information is required and where they're stored. And similar kind of guidelines could be incorporated into data sharing agreements or MOUs with transfer partners to ease that kind of transfer of course record information and making sure that faculty have the information they need in order to make the determination. And for any of these kind of solutions, it's important to really build buy-in and to improve buy-in and compliance to these kinds of standards. You know, you can create them. They probably already existed at the institutions we worked with. It's important that there's collaboration with the other stakeholders on establishing them and maintaining those guidelines and tools. And one way to kind of improve buy-in could be introducing that tool with data that demonstrates the challenge that it aims to address. So for example, showing faculty how long evaluations take, or how many credits in their department are failing to transfer or apply from this particular institution or compared to other academic departments. And a good example of this is our work with the University of Texas at Arlington, how they leverage the process mapping work we did as a part of this research to design and launch a transfer credit evaluation guide for their institution, which is really important and valuable in the context of UTA, which has, I think, I remember 76 or more sending institutions. So there's a lot of credits transferring in outside of the state, where there's policy to kind of, there's a lot of like novel courses coming in that need to be manually reviewed. And so having guidelines to really make that more efficient is important. So through the process mapping work we did as part of this research, they digged into their own kind of operational data and found that their transfer credit evaluations were taking an average of 16 weeks to complete. And so as part of this project, we convened colleagues, including faculty members and a lot of the people that had participated in interviews and focus groups, to review the process map findings and hear about this time lag. And, you know, that opened up discussions of why could this be happening? A big part of it was that faculty are away during the summer when there's a high increase in transfer credits needing to be reviewed. And starting to have a discussion about how can we reduce this time? Like, how can we make this more efficient, and so that transfer students can get an assessment of how many of their credits will come in and apply to their degree. So the director at the registrar's office at UTA used this momentum from these conversations to introduce a formal guide for the process and get the academic department's interest in reviewing it and really invested in making it a good guide. And they were able to develop a transfer credit evaluation process guide to train new faculty and have as a set of standards. So the second challenge area is around the more social or cultural gaps that I know a lot of your questions were interested in exploring. So for example, beliefs about the quality of instruction and academic preparation of transfer students. And I'm linking this to the challenge of limited awareness of problems and accountability to progress, because so many of the data infrastructure challenges that Marjorie spoke about. It's really actionable real-time data on transfer student success is not always available. And so getting that can be hard to really have align people's understanding of the problem and or the scope of a problem, and direct effort in a productive way and track progress. So one way to kind of address this is institutional and academic leadership could use data, be sharing out data with academic faculty and academic leadership about transfer student performance overall, or analyses on their academic performance in particular courses and course pathways. And so one kind of anecdote that came out at UT Arlington is that the accounting department had done some analyses at one point. I don't know that we know when it was done, but based on this, they saw that there was a course that some students were transfer students were struggling in, and instead of based on that information, requiring all transfer students take that course locally and potentially repeating a course, they implemented a common entrance exam that all students, both transfer and students that had started at the institution, took to kind of formally enter the accounting program and start taking intermediate courses. And this is a similar strategy to other professional programs like nursing programs, which I think makes sense given the context of those disciplines. There's a lot of interest in those kinds of professional geared programs, and there's also high external standards placed on those disciplines because of the certification exams that the departments are expected to prepare students to take. Outside of this kind of entrance exam or assessment readiness solution, resources allowing, there could be, an alternative solution could be providing a short-term refresher course for transfer students, or requiring students get tutoring to enroll in an upper level course rather than retake a course, or some ideas that are similar to what we see in kind of community college settings to address similar issues of academic preparation. And another use of data to guide transfer student success is for reviewing and revising curriculum. So in a separate initiative, the UT Office of Academic Affairs partnered with campuses to use data and analytics to really target curricular complexity. So they used time to degree metrics, along with, again, this kind of management data of complaints or graduation issues that had been required provost level intervention as a data point, along with degree flow charts and curriculum analytics tools. And so they use this data to better understand within majors that students were struggling in, where in the degree plan are they kind of getting caught up, and we're able to identify kind of old, unnecessary degree legacy requirements and courses to reduce the complexity of that curriculum. And so these two examples of internal assessment of a transfer student outcomes is important also to strengthen external collaboration. So having, for this final recommendation of having a joint strategy and accountability framework with transfer partners. I think often transfer partnerships are focused on articulation agreements, which it's an important solution, but grounding these conversations in transfer student outcomes and experiences and joint problem solving around that can help be more strategic in creating and maintaining articulation agreements. So for example, the University of Texas at Tyler, which is one of the institutions we partnered with, hosts annual transfer summits with each of their 3 or 4 primary partners to really strengthen the culture of collaboration and trust between their institutions. And all these sessions always start by sharing out and reflecting on data on the success of students from the sending institutions, how they're doing once they get to UTT. And that is used to ground a discussion on how to revise those course-to-course articulation guides, align their degree program pathways, and more substantively define the salient content needed to succeed in subsequent courses. And having open and honest conversations about how to ensure that's happening, that continuity is happening. So finally, a kind of structural challenge that feels important to name and that bubbled up in a few ways is this tension between establishing standards and policy to have guide credit transfer and consistency in these both how credits are transferring and the paths that students are taking, right, versus a more individualized decision-making or just the flexibility that accounts for disciplinary variation and the fact that curriculum evolves. So for course equivalency decision-making, I think there's some deciphering between kind of the necessary and more discretionary variations in how course-to-course articulations are being made. So for example, we heard that some faculty, even within the same discipline or department, had different standards for the % content match that they expected to see in order to deem a course equivalent. And ACRO has a standard that they use for this, a 75% standard for what % content match they consider good enough. And so that could be an example of an area where a standard can be set and that there maybe discretion is not needed versus the more disciplinary variations that are required to make sure that those decisions are making sense within the context of that field. Another way this exists is just the sheer issue of scale of course comparisons needed for articulation. And so I think we're seeing a lot of technology pop up around this and the proposition of machine learning and what it can do to help speed up what has been done manually for so long of tracking enrollment patterns and trying to map similar courses. And we didn't see any of that happening at the institutions we worked with. But based on what we heard from faculty, there would definitely need to be faculty oversight and approval of those recommendations. And their faculty might be kind of held up if there's limited information on the courses that are being recommended as a match.
Yeah. Sophia, can I quickly just add?
Sure.
So for additional context too, for all of these recommendations, we recognize that this is a lot to manage and deal with. And so the thing that we'll show next is our transfer ready assessment framework and toolkit, which Sophia will talk a little bit more about in detail. And we don't have time today to show you all of it, as Emily also shared. It is quite intensive. We spent a lot of time working with our institutional partners on it, but we did want to sort of showcase a little bit of the work that's engaged in that. As I'm looking at some of the questions and comments in the Q&A, we think that any and all resources that could be shared are great. And so this is sort of the place that we put all of them. So she'll get into that next.
Thank you for, I'm not watching what's going on in the chat. So, so finally, in contrast to this kind of tech assisted articulation is a positive example came out of our work is a relatively fresh take on articulation agreements. What we saw with the University of Texas at El Paso and their partner, their primary partner, El Paso Community College. And so they recently launched their Engineering Academy, which is a co-enrollment program, but it's special in a few ways. So students are able to be co-enrolled at both institutions and access the services across the different institutions. But faculty members in the engineering departments across institutions collaborated over the course of 2 years to really align their curriculum and like co-design a curriculum, reducing the number of specialties and majors within the college, and having hard conversations about the quality of instruction and even ensuring that the community college had the resources available, like lab equipment, to ensure there is an alignment and experience of courses taken at the community college and at the at UTEP. So we've talked a lot about the findings, and want to share a little bit about how we did the research and why. So we approached this as an action learning research project. The case studies that I just shared are what each of the institutions kind of the compiling the final event in the project was to have a retreat and to review the findings from the assessment and design a solution within the that fit their unique context. So we worked closely with an administrator at each of the campuses to design the research and conduct it, and they gathered cross-functional teams at their own campuses at a few points in the project to reflect on, act on the themes that came out of our data collection. So why does this matter? It's like, you know, I think that higher education is decentralized by design. And so there's all these variations in practice and policy, and advancing transfer student success really requires aligning people, the process, and technology. And those particular solutions are going to be specific to the institution and their partners and their broader system and state context. So as part of this project, we developed the Transfer Ready Systems Assessment Framework, which compiles and organizes recommendations from several existing publications and best practice guides into a single comprehensive framework. There's 10 categories of best practices, or what we call here transfer system change levers. So commitment from leadership, professional development and rewards, transfer student success interventions. And within each of these, there's a series of best practices. And the framework has questions to consider for groups to assess how they're advancing in that category. So, and these are organized into these 10 categories are organized into 3 spheres of influence that altogether shape the conditions for transfer students' experiences, outcomes, and success. So this framework is really designed to foster a shared understanding of and responsibility for how well a post-secondary system or institution is supporting transfer students, and really align on an issue, an area of change. And this framework is the backbone of a toolkit that we published that is really designed to help institutions, similar to what we did with our partners in UT, build cross-functional teams and engage stakeholders to align on strategy and action plans to enhance the transfer experience. And so it's organized into this process of taking a holistic look at your opportunities to advance transfer student success, bring people in whose perspective and buy-in will be important to making change. Step 3, engaging in data collection and self-assessment. So we have practical tools like the process mapping ones that UTA use to create and build buy-in for their transfer credit evaluation guidelines. And step 4, acting on the assessment and evidence. And some examples of some short-term wins that your institution might be able to use. These self-assessment tools outlined in the toolkit: credit evaluation decision trees, curricular templates. And so in the transfer ready systems or framework, there's a bunch of questions to consider that can kind of help guide discussions to create standards and templates and practices for your institution. All right.
Thank you all so much. So I just thoroughly enjoy how engaged folks have been. We've answered several questions already in the Q&A, so thank you for sharing those. There were a couple that or at least I wanted to make sure that we talked about. So there were 2 questions related to data and understanding sort of the number of credits that could have potentially increased and why, as well as whether or not we could determine the number of passing transfer credits. So I'm assuming the person meant passing grades that were accepted. And so a little bit just of additional detail about what we did in the report. And so there were important, again, differences between our institutional partners. So for example, at UT Arlington, transfer records are retained in administrative systems. However, 90% of those rejected transfer coursework didn't include any specifics. So we just know that there was a course somewhere that was rejected, but we don't have any information about that. Another example was that due to data on degree applicability, living in individual student plans, we received aggregate data. So there was some analysis that we simply couldn't do. So we didn't have variable indicators of whether a transfer course, for example, was applied to a student's degree at any particular point in time. So if they took a course somewhere else after they'd already matriculated, we didn't have access to that information. Similarly for UTEP, another example was that transfer coursework, for example, that earned credit but didn't have a grade wasn't included in our sample, but we did count it as sort of a credit towards students' degree plans. So again, that just sort of gets to the, this is not apples to apples, and even how individual institutions sort of track data really are left to individual decision makers within institutional research or the registrar's office or some of those other administrative roles. And so I think that it just really speaks to, again, how as a field, it would really, I think, serve us as well as our students if we did a little bit more work around how do we standardize and think about collecting and reporting on transfer student data. There was another question about, did we anticipate using this process to align professions that may have shortages, such as nursing and teaching, and that competitiveness and misalignment can contribute to extra courses being taken. So yes, this absolutely came up in our discussion around disciplinary differences and recognizing that there's sort of this give and take among faculty when making decisions about those courses. I think we recognized as well across all of our institutions that we had data for transfer student records, that nursing students did end up graduating with more excess credits than any of their peers. So there's something happening there, but we're not quite sure exactly what it is. But certainly that alignment would be really helpful in getting students to be able to, again, transition, particularly in these high need fields where we know that we need more experts and professionals doing this work. And so we're hoping that institutions will be able to use this, faculty committees will be able to use this to really think more critically, and using the toolkit to get in, to do a better job of supporting that alignment.
I know everyone is probably like me and trying to like soak it all in and think really hard, but also just be present in the moment because there's such rich information throughout the study. So oh, and here we go. There's a question right there in the box if someone wants to take it. In terms of standardization of processes, do you think state and or federal policy would be instrumental here? How do you envision seeing that standardization come to life? That is a great question. We get that a lot. What are the state and federal levers that we might need to pull to get this moving even more?
Yeah, I should have also mentioned that prior to joining MDRC, I was a tenure track faculty member at the University of Missouri Columbia. So I very much understand and can empathize with faculty and faculty discretion. I think there's a balance here. And so I think that when we spoke to our faculty members in this study, for example, there were a lot of questions and I think concerns about process. And so getting input from faculty to determine how do we align curriculum and what are we giving students credit for example. And so I think that there's, yes, a need for improved standardization that also accounts for some of these disciplinary or department and major differences. And that really does a better job of getting collective input from faculty across institutional types. And that's not simply 4-year and 2-year, but I think public and private as well, because students transfer between all of our institutions. So I think the short answer is yes. But the caveat is that that would really require a significant shift in how we think about input from key stakeholders in that process.
And one thing I'll add is I think there's a we were working in Texas, and the Texas legislature is pretty active in this space. So there is field of study curriculum, so statewide pathway curricula, as well as a core curriculum and reporting requirements. So I don't think there was necessarily a desire for any more of the state policy, but what we did hear was like, it would be useful to have some like infrastructure and technology from the state. So like multi-institution and space of course records and to facilitate the decision-making locally.
Yeah, I love that technology is a piece that you address and that some people talked about in the report. And to that end, we have some folks on the call, I believe, that have direct pipelines to these technology developers. So as this, forgive me if this is hard to answer off the top of your head, but what I'm curious about is based on this work that you've done, you've got the report out, you've done all of these focus groups, are there any messages you would like to give to the folks developing the technology to support this to say, you need to pay more attention to fill in the blank to help this process go a little more smoothly? And remember, one of the comments in the report seemed to be acknowledging that there's lots of technology out there, but there are limitations. And then also around, you may evaluate a course one time, but what if the course changes? What triggers are in place to follow up and reevaluate this? So anything that comes to mind for you that you want the technology developers to be aware of?
Yeah, I'd say that is one of them, like a record of previous decisions and allowing that. And I do think it would be important to have good course information there. And I think something we didn't get to do in this report, but would be good future research is really diving into more of the student learning outcomes aspects and like the other, and really the build of a syllabi and how that should be kind of incorporated into this technology. I think faculty are still going to want to see details on the course, and might not be the syllabi from that specific semester, but more information beyond a recommendation, I think.
And the only thing I'd add to that, technology is great. It's so useful. It can certainly improve our effectiveness and efficiency, but also recognizing that it's only a piece of the puzzle. And so we can't simply say like technology is going to fix everything, because that won't work either. So I think it's sort of a balance of understanding the process and where does technology fit in, to help us fill some of these gaps and do this work a little bit better. And then I see that there's a question here on, I'm going to come back to the payment one, but I did see about transfer credits and whether or not they're reported on students' transcripts with the original grade listed. So this was back to some of our institutional data challenges, and that it totally depended on what institutions chose to keep or not keep. So typically, if a course, for example, was accepted initially as a transfer credit, and so it would show up as, transfer course X, 3 credits, but it may not necessarily have a grade. For other institutions, those grades were included, and then those grades were then calculated as a part of their I'm sorry, but those grades were not then included as a part of their GPA calculation. So oftentimes registrars mentioned the fact that this was a lot about like record keeping and trying to keep those records as clean as they could. And so essentially information that wasn't kept was seen as unnecessary or extraneous, or didn't serve the institution's purposes. And so that really was, I think, a challenge is sort of understanding like what students are leaving their institutions with and what are they showing up with, and then what gets lost in transition. And so there's still some work to be done there. But I think I'm going to speak for the whole team that we were really surprised at how different that looked from institution to institution.
Well, I will say on behalf of all of our over 200 live attendees today and the hundreds others that signed up to get the recording later, thank you for the time and effort you put into this very meaty report that I know I've enjoyed digging into and looking at, and to the assessment tool as well, because that practical, okay, but now what? How do I do this piece is so critically important. So thank you for paying attention to both sides of that research project. Sophia and Marjorie, we thank you so much for spending an hour with us today to dive into this. Appreciate your time and expertise. Everyone on the call, it's wonderful to see you as always. And yes, it's being recorded, and we'll follow up with an email in a few days to send the link so that you can share this with all of your colleagues and rewatch and kind of take another minute to dig into all of these rich findings. So thanks so much for being here, everyone. And thank you, Marjorie and Sophia and MDRC, for doing this great work. Really appreciate you all.
Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thank you so much for coming.